everyone, it's Mariana with Three Peaks Classroom. Today I want to talk to you about Daily 5. So I want to spend some time today talking about how I go about preparing for Daily 5, the steps that I take to make sure that everything is ready to go. So I'm going to break this video up into kind of 3 parts. The first part is going to be lessons, activities, expectations, everything that I prepare before we actually dive into a Daily 5 round. And that's pretty much kind of like the first 2 or 3 weeks of September. And then the second topic I want to talk to you guys about is what my 5 stations typically look like when we do a Daily 5 round. And then the last thing I'm going to explain is how I go about actually transitioning with my students, how I have it all set up, and how it's been working for me. So let's get started. In order for me to be successful at Daily 5, it's really important that I teach every single expectation very explicitly. I teach grade 4, and we are a Daily 5 school. So this is not new information for my students by any stretch, but I do like to just go over all the expectations really quickly, and it can be a really quick 5-minute mini lesson, and it has been actually with my group. And each expectation is laid out. So I asked the students, what would the principal see if she walked in while we were all reading to ourselves? What would she see and what would she hear? And so we wrote that on a chart piece of paper and created a mini poster. So it looks like us staying in one spot. It looks like us actually reading the pages and not just staring at our book. It looks like us not talking, reading quietly or reading silently to ourselves. So again, establishing those expectations for each of those 5 stations is going to be super, super important. And in September, I do take it really slowly. I actually go through the expectations and I say, okay, my friends, we're going to come and we're going to practice what that looks like. Read to self is a big one. That's the one that I start with. And in order for my students to be able to read to themselves with a book that is appropriate, the very first reading strategies lesson that I teach to my grade 4s is finding a just right book. Now I'm currently in the process of creating my grade 4 reader's notebook. So I just borrowed the idea from my grade 3 reader's notebook, from my language arts notebook. In our reader's notebook section, this is a notebook that the students create with me, all on different reading strategies on how to be smarter and stronger readers. And one of the very first lessons that we read, or one of the very first lessons that we learn about, is finding a just right book for you. And so I go and talk to the students about what does that mean, what does that look like, and we actually did this lesson on the 2nd day of school. So we talked about finding a book that's not too hard and not too easy, something that is just right. And I did this because A, I want them to practice finding a book, obviously that fits their level, but B, I don't have their reading levels yet, so I don't exactly know which book is most appropriate for them. So this also gives them the autonomy to go and find a book that is their level and something that they're interested in. Once I have the reading levels for all of my students, I actually conference with each and every one of them, and I'm going to show you what that looks like. So after we've had the lesson on just right books, and once I get my reading levels from my students from maybe the teacher previous or our learning coach, then I get out my reading binder. This is something that I prep even in the summertime. And all it is I have a bunch of these sheets photocopied in different sections for my students. And I have a graph for each of my students, and I have a check-in page for each of my students. And so I will call each of my students, I will sit down with them, I have a list, I sit down with each of my students and I check in with them and I explain what this graph is all about. And I'll have a bar, like a bar graph, showing them what level they are at, and I always congratulate them and I'll say, wow, like you're reading at a level D. Even though they maybe should be reading at a level P, it doesn't matter. I'll say, look at you, look at all the levels that you have achieved already. That is fantastic. And I'll say, what I want to see every time I test your reading is I want to see you achieving more levels. And so I say, how do I do that? Or how can you do that? And I show them this page. And I explain to them, when I meet with you one-on-one, or maybe in a very small group, I'm going to write down the date. I'm going to write down what book you're reading, just to make sure that you are reading different books. that are just the right fit for you. And then I'll write down some super high five things that you are doing right now that are working really well for you. Maybe you are using the pictures, maybe you are rereading the sentence because it didn't make sense to you, or maybe you are cross-checking to make sure that the word that you're saying actually makes sense in the sentence. I will explain to the kids that these are the super high five things that they are already doing while they are reading. And I explain to the kids, I will always give you one tip or one strategy to work on when you read to yourself so that you can achieve those levels. So I go through and I explain this to each single one of my students, and this is their graph. When I'm finished, I give them a bag, like a Ziploc bag, and I ask them to please go and find their just right book in the level whatever, H. And I ask them to please find 3 books, put them in the Ziploc bag, and put it inside your desk. Those are your just right books. Those are your books that you're going to use for reading to yourself. This is what a typical book bag in my class would look like. It's just a really large Ziploc bag. This is part of their school supplies. And this student is a level K. And so inside their book bag, they have 3 books, all in their level. And these are the books that they are expected to read when it's read to self time, just these books. So I make that super clear to them. When it's time to read to ourselves, I want you to take out your book bag and read these books. I also make the expectation very clear that when you are finished all 3 of the books in the bag, that's when you can take and go back to the bin and you can exchange your books. I really want to limit the amount of times that they're getting up and exchanging books, so that's why I encourage students to have 3 books. If they are in a higher level, like getting into novels and things, I will encourage them to have 1 or 2 just because they are longer. And if they're in the lower levels like A, B, C, D, E, I'll encourage them to have 4 books because they should be going through those books relatively quickly. But these are their read to self bags. They are a Ziploc bag, really simple, and it stays in their desk. The last thing we practice before we actually get into the stations of Daily 5 is I talk about reading muscles. Now, if you've read the Daily 5 and the Cafe book, they talk a lot about reading stamina. And I do use that word with my students, but I relate stamina to reading muscles. How strong are your reading muscles? And we practice it. And I show them what really strong reading muscles look like, where I'm reading a story, I'm reading the words, flipping the pages, I'm concentrating, I'm not being distracted by outside noises, and I encourage the kids to make noises, and I show them that I'm really focused on my book. That's a really strong reading muscle. And then I show them obviously the other example, which they love. So we practice reading muscles with the class. I'm not even joking. This year, the very first time we practiced reading muscles, we got to 5 seconds. My students read for 5 seconds before I noticed somebody was looking up from their book and looking around. And so we talked about how our reading muscles are weak right now. Maybe it's because of the summertime, maybe it's because we're not interested in the book, but we need to continue to practice our reading muscles. So right now I think we're a little bit higher than that. I think the last time I checked them was about 5 minutes or so, but we have started our Daily 5 rotations, which is why I did want to film this video now after I have gone through it with my students a few times. All right, so now I want to talk to you about what my 5 stations look like when we actually get into Daily 5. And I'll be honest, yesterday was the first day that we started 4 stations, so we haven't quite included the 5th station yet, which is work on writing. But we did do 4 stations. We did read to self, we did read with someone, we did a word game, and we also did listening to reading. So I'm really happy that we did all 4 of those stations. The very first time we did Daily 5, I did 2 stations, read to yourself and read with someone. And both of those times, the students did very well transitioning between stations. They did really well taking care of my materials and things. So I felt really confident jumping from 2 to 4, just back-to-back days. And then pretty soon here next week, we're gonna add in that 5th station. So again, you're setting those expectations with all 5 of your stations. Read to self, I've already explained, the kids know right now, when it's their turn to read to themselves, they go to their desks, they take their bag out, they have all 3 books that they can choose from. I even have silencing headphones in the class that they are welcome to wear. at their desks while they are reading to themselves. Once we get a lot more proficient at reading to ourselves, I will encourage or allow the kids to find a spot in the classroom where they are most comfortable. But right now, for classroom management, I am asking that the kids stay at their desks while they read to themselves. Moving on to read with someone. So the expectation is that you find a partner or a small group of 3, and my limit is 3. So finding a small group of kids that are in your rotation, and I'll explain that at the end of the video. Finding a small group of kids, the expectation is they all go to my big carpet, which is over there, which is why I'm pointing that way. And you can read any book in the classroom. So that could be any of the read aloud picture stories that I have read to my students. It could be a nonfiction book. It could be a leveled book. It could be a comic book. It could be a textbook. It could be anything. Anything that they are interested in reading all together. And so just yesterday, there was a group of kids. I had to do 4 in a group just because one of them came late and the 3 of them were already reading, but that's besides the point. They wanted to read the book with no pictures. I want them to engage. I want them to have fun. I want them to really enjoy reading, especially with a friend. So that is my goal with Read with Someone. Now, of course, if it's getting to be a little bit noisy and a little bit out of hand, I will step in and make sure that the kids are reading a little quieter, but for the most part, I really do like to see that. So here you're going to see I have a ton of resources when it comes to choosing a game for word work. These resources are provided by my school, which is fantastic. I have a whole tub of different sort of phonics games or writing games, things like that I can choose from. And then these 2 resources I have put together myself. It's a resource that you can purchase on TPT. It's not my resource, but if you just look up Toothy, like grammar resources or Toothy phonics resources, these are so fun. We actually used this yesterday, and I used this exact game yesterday. So in our grammar, we've been talking about nouns. And so this was out on a table on this carpet, actually. The students would take turns. They each get one of these cards with a whiteboard marker. And each of the kids would take a turn being a leader, and they would just take one of these cards without looking at the answer on the back, and they would lead the group by asking them the question, which word is the noun? They have to read these words out loud. Everybody, including the leader, has to write down their answer with a whiteboard marker, and then when everybody is ready, the leader will flip it over, and if whoever wrote the correct answer, they get to draw a tooth in the happy grin here. So this is a really fun game. It's on TPT, and my kids love playing it, or they loved playing it. And the expectation too is when they're done playing the word game, that they tidy it up and get it all ready for the next group. But you can see here, I have a whole bin dedicated for just grammar, and I have a whole bin dedicated for phonics activities. So I will typically bring out one of these games for the group, or sometimes I might even take out 5 and ask the kids to play silently at their own desks. So it'll change. I like to change it up so that it's not always the same thing all the time. And I do like to dig into here and look at a lot of the games that we have in here. Just a fantastic resource that my school put together. But that is typically what I choose for my word games. The 4th station is listening to reading. This is, pretty standard, pretty typical. My students take out their Chromebooks. They log into either Raz Kids or Epic. Right now we're doing Epic because my school hasn't purchased the license yet for Raz Kids, which is totally fine. And I just asked them to go into Epic, and I asked them to pick any book that they were interested in reading and just listen to it. But when we get into Raz Kids, of course, Raz Kids, you can have them read their leveled books, which is great as well. So we will transition or switch out between those 2 websites. And I just indicated on my PowerPoint here, which I'll show you in a minute, I'll indicate if it's Epic Day or Raz Kids Day. Now the last one we haven't started yet, just because I didn't want to jump from 0 to 60 right away, but work on writing. Typically in my class, what that looks like is they're working on their own individually, either on like a grammar worksheet. So I showed you that right now we are working on identifying nouns. This week actually we're heading into talking about pronouns, and so I might have a worksheet for them just to reinforce those skills. It could be a journal prompt. I like to do journals every day after lunch, but some days we don't have time to do journals because of our schedule. So if that's the case, then I would have my kids, I'd give them an individual journal prompt, and they would be spending the 10 minutes writing in their journals. Or if we are in our narrative unit or our poetry unit, I would have them use that time to continue writing and developing their personal narratives drafts, or their fictional narratives, or their poetry, things like that. That is a time that I would spend with my students. That is time I would have them write in the Daily 5 station. So moving on to transitions, the last piece. I'm going to show you guys what my PowerPoint looks like. This is exactly what my students see when we do Daily 5 stations. And yesterday I explained it very clearly to them. That is their timer. They have 10 minutes, or maybe a little bit more, a little bit less, depending on the day. And then here are the stations. So read to self, I always start at the top, and I have a list of student names. So those students know that their first station is to read to themselves. Then word work, whoop, right there, word work. I purposefully put it green, just because it's the small green carpet, but I also did label here, where do you meet for word work? It's at the small carpet. Sometimes that changes because of things we have going on in our classroom, but typically that's where I have my word games. You can see work on writing. I have a picture of their desks. That is the expectation. I do want them to be at their desks writing. Reading with someone at the big carpet. I've already talked about that. And then in this particular case, my students would be at their desks reading Raz Kids. And like I mentioned before earlier in the video, once we get a lot more confident and competent reading to ourselves without distractions, then I might get the students to go, whichever place they want in the classroom. They can grab a cushion, grab themselves some silencing headphones, and then they could read to themselves. So when I have a PAT skit, or when I have a star student of the day or student of the day, they manage this for me so that I can stay at my guided reading table and work on book club groups or work on writing groups, things like that. So they would be responsible for starting the timer. They would be responsible for clicking to the next slide when it's time to rotate. So on my next slide, then this red group would move down here, orange would move here, etc. So that I don't have to get up from my table, which is very convenient. So that is how I run my Daily 5 stations in a nutshell. I hope you found this video helpful. I would love to help answer any of your questions that you have. Maybe this is your first time doing Daily 5. Maybe you need some help with ideas for, word games or things to do for writing, things like that. If you have any questions about my reading binder materials, they are a free download in my TPT store. So if you like the chart system that I have, or the conferencing checklist that I have, you can definitely go ahead and download yourself a copy. But yeah, I hope you found that helpful and interesting. If you haven't already subscribed, please do. I do share content like this quite frequently. And I hope you guys have a wonderful day, and I'll catch you in the next video. Bye.